Welcome to the Fear and Greed Business Interview. I'm Sean Aylmer. It's hard to remember a more volatile time on the world stage. With Donald Trump in the White House, global markets are swept up in the uncertainty of tariffs on key trading partners and the threat of an all-out trade war. Then there's a war in Ukraine, with the US splitting with Europe over how to handle the Russian invasion, headlined by the disastrous confrontation between Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenksyy, Donald Trump and Vice President J.D. Vance in the Oval Office. At the same time, China is still strengthening its presence in our own region, circumnavigating Australia with warships. And all of this is happening as we gear up for a federal election, with polls suggesting we're heading for a minority government. Chris Uhlmann is a political contributor at Sky News and a columnist at The Australian. Chris, welcome back to Fear and Greed.
Sean, great to be with you.
So let's start with the US. How would you describe the first 50 days in office for Donald Trump?
Traumatic for the rest of the world. Never a dull moment. It's clear that Donald Trump believes in the old adage that, the powerful do what they will and the weak suffer as they must. It would appear that he's going to split the world up into hemispheres, and he wants pretty much all of the Western Hemisphere, stretching from Greenland down to Panama and maybe all the way to Argentina, who could possibly say. But then that means that we end up in a different hemisphere, right? We're in the Eastern Hemisphere where China is, and he might leave Europe to the Russians. So we're seeing a reordering of the way that the world works. We're seeing an American president walking away from the strategic circumstances that have pretty much governed the world since the end of the Second World War. So we are living indeed in interesting times, as the Chinese curse would have it.
Yes, let's dive into that a bit. Let's start with Ukraine, something that you know a lot about. You have actually interviewed Volodymyr Zelenksyy, I know, and done some work on Ukraine. Where does that stand at the moment?
Well, it's pretty clear that the American president is walking away from the Ukrainian president because he doesn't believe he's getting what he wants at the moment. The United States is essentially now suspending the military aid that they're giving to Ukraine, and Ukraine can't survive without it. Puts him, that's President Trump, at odds, obviously, with Europe and with Keir Starmer in the UK. So the United Kingdom and the Europeans are saying they're going to stand by Ukraine. But look, let's be clear, Sean, there has to be a ceasefire and there has to be an end to this war. And unfortunately, at the moment, the position of Ukraine is very different from when I was there at the end of 2023. At that stage, they had pushed Russians back along the front line where they had advanced, not back across the border, but certainly they had made some advances in their own territory. They're now going to be negotiating from a position of weakness, but it would appear that Volodymyr Zelenksyy has certainly now decided that he wants to have talks that include the United States. There are going to be talks in Saudi Arabia. I know that Marco Rubio is heading there at the moment. Ukrainians will be represented at those talks. One would hope that the United States started with a strong bargaining position, but given it said that, being in NATO is not going to be part of it, and there have been other concessions already, well, it would seem to me that all the cards are with Vladimir Putin.
Is there a strategy to this, to what Donald Trump's doing?
Oh, who could possibly say? Look, I read all of these articles where people say, that the president's playing three-dimensional chess, that there is a greater, that some believe that, in fact, what he's trying to do is to split Russia from China, and this is one of the plays and the way that he'll go about it. Look, it's a really fascinating thing, Sean, that inside the conservative movement, particularly the MAGA movement in the United States, there is a very pro-Putin part of that. Now, he has been playing to that crowd for many, many years. In fact, and his play was essentially this. He rebooted the Orthodox Church inside Russia. He presents himself as the last Christian ruler. And that plays very well to the Christian right in the United States. They believe that. So, that he said that they're never going to basically engage in same-sex marriage. They're not going to allow the gender ideology, which Putin would say has infected the West, to infect him. And there are people inside the US, particularly the Christian US and the Christian right, that really appeals to. So he's been making that message loud and clear for a long time, and it's clearly had an effect.
What about closer to home, or at least close to the US home? Canada, Justin Trudeau was very tough on Donald Trump. Mexico, same deal in terms of tariffs. Canada's got a new prime minister now. How does that play out? That actually surprises me more than anything else.
Yeah, but see, what's happened too now is that the Liberals are back in the race. They were going to be trounced by the Conservatives. They were behind at every single poll. And what Trump has done is to put Mark Carney, who will now be the candidate, back in the race in that.
Yeah.
Because the Canadians, no matter what else, have certainly banded together over the fact that they don't want to be the 51st state of the United States. So Trump may well have overplayed his hand on that front, if indeed he cares about who is the Prime Minister in Canada, and there's every chance that he probably doesn't. But it's certainly not helping the Conservatives at all in Canada at the moment, and has breathed life back into the Liberals' campaign. So that will be really interesting to watch. They'll go to the polls very shortly. But yeah, look, a lot of this stuff too is that he's very serious about ending the fentanyl crisis in the United States. And that drug, basically manufactured in China, comes across the border from Mexico in enormous amounts and does come across the Canadian border. That's really what he's playing at here. He wants them to make sure that they do more about their borders. That drug kills 100,000 Americans a year. That is an extraordinary toll. And I can see why the president would want to put an end to that.
Stay with me, Chris. We'll be back in a minute. My guest this morning is Chris Uhlmann, political contributor to Sky News and The Australian. Let's bring it closer to home, China. How worried should we be about the live firing exercises, the circumnavigation of Australia by Chinese warships?
Well, Sean, when the government dismissed it as nothing really out of the ordinary, can you remember the last time that a non-allied ship had a live fire exercise off the east coast of Australia? And if you can't, I'll remind you, it was between 1942 and 1943 when there was a lot of submarine presence there. They attacked Sydney Harbour and quite a lot of ships were sunk within the course of that year. We have done everything since the Second World War to ensure that that never happens again. So this is no small thing. And what the Chinese did was they lapped Australia with their ships and maybe a submarine, and they set out to see whether or not we could keep pace with them. And guess what? It turns out we can't. We can't circumnavigate our own country with our own navy and continue to fuel it. So that should send a pretty loud message to the people who are running defence policy in Australia that we are entirely on the wrong track and we really need to do something about that. We've invested all of our chips essentially in submarines that will be delivered over the horizon. Most of our money is going there. The increase in defence spending of $50 billion over 10 years, that's $5 billion a year. That's not much. But then again, Sean, I put this to you. Even if we gave defence more money, who could say that they'd spend it wisely?
No, I agree. What about the timing of it? Post-Trump, with all sorts of question marks about who's US allies and who aren't. I mean, was it deliberate?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's sending the message that Trump has basically not really said anything about alliances that's been in any way positive. In fact, he has slapped higher tariffs on his allies at the moment than he has on China. There was talk from one of his people that they would pull Canada out of the Five Eyes intelligence gathering agreement, which is the sort of crown jewels for countries like Canada and Australia. So China's sending the message that you're all alone and naked at the bottom of the world. Do you really think that Donald Trump is necessarily going to be here for you if you would need it? And look, the thing about it is that Australia is not in any imminent chance of invasion. So let's put that to one side. But given that we only have 2 weeks supply of fuel in this country, we could easily be cut off from our vital supplies with a Chinese Navy. And what might cause that? Well, an attack on Taiwan might cause that. They might want to separate us from the United States at that stage. And what would we do then? So there's every cause to be worried about whether or not we can defend even our own trade routes.
Okay, let's bring it home to domestic politics. Chris, Western Australia, good result for the Labor Party over there. Obviously, the floods and ex-cyclone Alfred delayed the calling of the election. Where do you think the government stands at the moment, the federal government stands at the moment?
Well, look, I hear all of this talk about the fact that Anthony Albanese is going to be doing quite badly according to the polls. And I look at the news poll in The Australian this morning and I see that the primary vote for the Labor Party is 32% and the primary vote for the coalition is about 39%. Go back to the last election, the primary vote for the Labor Party was a little over 32% and the primary vote for the coalition was a little over 36%, so, and that's inside the margin of error. So it could say to you that absolutely nothing has changed since the last election. And then when you look at the hopes that the Liberal Party had in Western Australia to pick up quite a number of seats there to at least return it to something like a normal opposition, it did really badly on the weekend. So I believe the fact that the coalition's in with the show when I actually see it, and that'll be on polling day. I'll wait until then to make a call on that stuff. What we would imagine is that the Labor Party loses some skin. Anthony Albanese sits on 78 seats. He's got to have 76 in order to form government. You would imagine that he loses some. The most likely outcome then of the next election, based on everything that we can see at the moment, is that it will be a Labor minority government. And even if not in agreement with the Greens and the Teals, with the Greens and the Teals agreeing to supply for the Labor Party and a more left-wing Senate, which means that government could get a whole lot worse than it is now.
Do you think that'll happen?
I think that's the most likely outcome at the moment. Things could change. And I think there are small things that happen too for a Prime Minister. I mean, the cyclone was a terrible thing in the end, but it could have been way worse. Like, if you'd come ashore as a Category 2, and you think about Brisbane, you've been there, all those old Queenslanders made out of wood, basically. The destruction could have been a lot worse than it was. And that's not minimising, by the way, the fact that a lot of people have suffered a lot and it's going to cost a lot of money. But I think that's a good thing for the Prime Minister. I think the Prime Minister did a pretty credible job in the course of this event. And, Queensland's going to be in a very important state, and that part of Queensland, southeast Queensland, is where all the votes are. So, even small things matter, like events do matter. And now he has a little bit more time. Like, he wanted to go in April, now he'd be going in May. Maybe it turns out to be better for him.
Chris, do you miss the press gallery?
No.
I've got to ask you. Good. Let's leave it at that. Chris, thank you for talking to Fear and Greed.
Thank you, mate.
That's Chris Uhlmann, political contributor at Sky News and a columnist at The Australian. This is the Fear and Greed Business Interview. Join us every morning for the full episode of Fear and Greed, daily business news for people who make their own decisions. I'm Sean Aylmer. Enjoy your day.